Welcome back to SourceFedNERD. I'm Whitney Moore, and as a bona fide comic book fan, I get a little heated when I see people make broad assumptions over misunderstandings of the genre. Things like it's only for kids or it's not legitimate art, but most recently, comics have been ruined by those pesky meddling SJWs. For those of you who don't know, a social justice warrior is a term jerks like to use on the internet in order to silence conversations about equality. And yeah, we can admit here that sometimes you take one too many hits of Tumblr and privilege becomes the only thing you talk about, and that's obnoxious. You can't Google the words SJW and comics without a whole bunch of articles popping up about how Marvel sales are down because they're being too progressive, or how SJW culture is ruining comic books for its fans. You know what I say to that? Whoever wrote these articles don't know dick about comics, because comics have literally always been about social justice. Look at this picture, see? So now I'm gonna take you cucks through comic book history, so the next time somebody complains about how all of a sudden SJWs have ruined comics, you can well actually them straight back to their shitty little forums on 4chan. Ready? Let's start at the very beginning, and to do that we need to go all the way back to the 1930s. Hey there, Sprouts, how you growing? It's the 1930s and we're deep in the worst depression to ever hit the good old US of A. Unemployment is sitting at a record high, and so we're looking for a little escapism and a lot of heroism. Comic books are the cat's pajamas, the bee's knees, jazz, smoking cigarettes from long-ass holders, other old-timey things. Alright, you get the idea. But while the lack of a job market and the inability to find a home was a huge problem for most Americans, the 30s were also embroiled in some pretty heavy social injustice. In 1934, two Jewish immigrants by the names of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created a character who represented everything the downtrodden working class of the 1930s dreamed of. Of course, I'm talking about Superman, and he too was an immigrant with a rural upbringing, only he had the infinite power to stop anything that stood in the path of truth, justice, and the American way. Alan Moore put it best when he said, in his earlier adventures with an admirably broad-minded definition of what constituted criminality, a splendidly egalitarian man of tomorrow would rough up strikebreakers and use his super strength to hurl unscrupulous slum landlords over the horizon. In fact, Superman's first appearance was in a comic called Superman, Champion of the Oppressed. It debuted in 1938 and cost just 10 cents. So that was at the very beginning of comic book history, but let's see if that sort of social justice heroism keeps consistent throughout the years. Spoiler warning, it does. After the creation and popularity of Superman, we became a nation obsessed by superheroes. We got Batman, the Spirit, Bullet Man, then the first ever female superhero, Wonder Woman, all sharing the same common goal of punishing villains and making the world a better place. Superheroes have always been designed around social and political issues as a way for readers to help navigate their own moral compass during turbulent times. The next huge example of this would be World War II. There are literally story arcs and entire issues dedicated to Batman, Robin, the Human Torch, and Wonder Woman all fighting the Axis powers. And since the topic of whether it's okay or not to punch a Nazi is especially relevant these days, I'm gonna go ahead and say yes, it's totally okay to punch a Nazi. Check it out, if Wonder Woman can do it, so can you. Anyways, Captain America himself was the first superhero to don an American flag, and you bet he was created to fight Nazis. Here he is punching Hitler on the cover of his debut issue. But Whitney, you say, isn't using comic books to strengthen people's approval of the government's goals propaganda? Well, sure, we can use that argument. After comic books first blew up, it was decided that there couldn't be such a massive industry of entertainment without having some sort of regulation. The Comics Code Authority was the solution to this as a sort of code of ethics for publishers and seal of approval for parents. These squeaky clean rules explicitly stated that there should not be any sort of content that would encourage dissent towards the police, government officials, and so on. So until the underground comic book scene came years later, you can assume that a lot of Golden Age comics all were pretty much aligned in good old American values. But that's a subject for another video. Even with all the regulations of the Comics Code Authority, superheroes have been used to push progressive values or talk about social issues that might have not been so easy to speak out about once upon a time. In fact, in the 1970s, the Department of Health approached Stan Lee to create a comic that would talk about drug addiction, so he wrote it into a Spider-Man story. Marvel had to bypass the Comics Code in order to publish it, but the comic was such a success that other publishers also took the hint and started talking about social issues without the code's consent. Publishers using comic books and superheroes to talk about the issues became so popular that the Comics Code Authority was rendered completely obsolete. Maybe because writers, artists, and publishers know there's an inherent value in using art to talk about tough issues, no dang code of conduct required. With the code no longer relevant in the 80s, DC and Marvel were free to make their characters more flawed in order to confront societal issues. Child abuse was revealed to be the reason behind Hulk's rage, Lex Luthor went from being an evil inventor to a corrupted businessman, and Iron Man was revealed to be an alcoholic. The 80s also introduced the first openly gay and HIV-positive superhero, Extraño. Looking back, it was a pretty offensive character, but his battle with a white supremacist AIDS vampire named Hemogoblin was never nevertheless an important benchmark in comics addressing the AIDS epidemic. Of course, after that you got a lot more respectful and legitimate portrayals of gay superheroes, including my personal forever and always OTP Apollo and Midnighter. Man, they're cute. Now let's take a minute to talk about race relations in comics, because representation here has historically been far from perfect. From characters of color being downright offensive to an overall lack of heroes that aren't white, it's legitimate to look back and wish these publishers were more forward-thinking. However, these comics are a reflection about how society portrayed people of color at the time, and I think credit is due for some of the comic industry's subversiveness even at a time when people weren't ready to accept people of color as heroes. For example, let's take a look at the X-Men, one of the most famous comics for exploring themes about how society treats people who are different. Both Professor X and Magneto were inspired by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, respectively, and while of course it would have been better to have them portrayed as black guys, the point still stands that a definite statement about social and civil rights were being made here. They both fought for the rights of mutants and against how they were oppressed in society, albeit in very different ways. So let's jump to current comics, because a lot of interesting stuff is happening here right now. A lot of fanboys and girls have been pretty pissed off about the newer, more progressive iterations of their favorite classic characters. Thor is a girl now, Iron Man is also a girl, but she's a black teen, McCannon! Don't worry, I have plenty of opinions on recycling existing characters in order to fit a progressive narrative, but I'll have to save that for another video as well. Point is, there's a lot going on, and in this incredible, terrible, wonderful, horrifying current world, conversations about social justice can take place easier than ever. If you're still watching, I assume you didn't come here to have your mind changed, but instead are a true comic book fan who knows your history. But hey, now you can have me backing you up the next time somebody says SJWs are ruining comic books. Because really guys, a hero is somebody who defends the rights and the safety of the people. Why wouldn't superheroes be SJWs? Thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to SourceFedNERD, and I will see you next time.
I can dive into one of the few things we do know about this movie, and that's what the hell Thanos is up to.
Let's rattle them all off and learn a little bit more about each of them, starting with the characters whom I found most interesting.